realfaith.org.au.
The footprints of Jesus are all over this country. We're just not seeing them. And we need interpreters who are going to say, listen, you love the Far West Children's Scheme. You love the Flying Doctor Service. Well, why aren't we allowed to say, Jesus Christ was the one behind this idea, that John Flynn would not have done that. No Jesus, no Flying Doctor Service.
Welcome to Real Faith. Conversations about the impact faith has on our lives and the challenges we go through, helping us today and giving us hope for tomorrow. That's real people, real life, and real faith with Eric Scatterbo.
Well, today we have part 3 of our 3-part conversation with the Outback historian, Paul Rowe. Paul's the author of the book, Tell Me Another, A Storyteller's Search for Australia's Lost Faith. Paul's been sharing with us his life journey and about the importance of preserving Australia's spiritual heritage. And of course, he's been sharing lots and lots of stories as well. Once again, Paul is joining us from his home in Dubbo in New South Wales. And then, next, you became involved in tourism. How did that come about?
Well, I was teaching in Cornerstone, so we'd have 20, 30 students sitting in the classroom every day, and we'd be having to teach the Bible, but you couldn't shut the door on what was happening all around us with droughts and floods and crop failures and successes and all that sort of stuff. And then the real social problems that were there in town, with the Indigenous community was suffering and struggling with their identity right in the main street. We ran coffee shops for kids on weekends. So it was right in our face. So, you couldn't be talking theory about stuff. You had to kind of come up with real answers to real questions.
Yeah, it had to be grounded in reality. And so one of the steps I took, because I was a historian and I was invited to think about being on local council, and I had no real idea what local councils did. So I ended up, there I am in local council, and I realised, okay, you work out a little portfolio for yourself. So I could say, well, my background as a historian would help, because Burke had a very diligent group of amateur historians who'd done a prodigious amount of work, and they had 12, 14 volumes of Burke history that they'd culled. But very few people were going to sit down and read 14 volumes of Burke history. So they sit in the library or around the place. And I began to see, well, what we need to do is get these stories out into the marketplace, because they're Burke's greatest asset. Burke had amazing stories that were hidden. You couldn't see them. If you drove into town, you'd just see the problems. But I knew that we could do something with this. So the opportunity came up for Cornerstone to help run the tourist centre, which we did. And I learned a great deal through that, because when you're out in the tourist market, you've got people roll through the door. They come up from Melbourne, they've got stickers on their caravan. They roll in the door and they say, well, tell me a story. And I said, well, step this way. So I'm glad you asked.
Every day we'd have these people come through the door. Yeah, I'm glad you asked. And we had great fun telling and road testing all these stories that we had. And people were looking at me going, this is amazing. How come we never hear these stories? Nobody's ever told us this story, Yeah. So I realised the little what seemed like small stories in Burke were actually stories, one, that were as big as Australia, and two, were plugged in directly into the human story. So as you told them, people identified with them. They get tears in their eyes. They say, wow, that's amazing.
That's powerful.
So I realised, wow, we've got an asset. We're sitting on this big pile of stories, and amongst them, Eric, was so many stories of Christians who'd done significant things, not just for Burke, but for Australia, And so the Flying Doctor Service, the Far West Children's Scheme, Mother Teresa, Mother McKillop, all these people have been in Burke, and they've done amazing things, serving people with education, medical care, pastoral care, gifted the bush with amazing things, and that came out of their faith. There was no question about it. And as I joined those dots for people, they look at me and go, wow, I didn't realise that. I didn't realise that that's why John Flynn did that. So, for example, I interviewed a mail truck driver who used to drive the mail truck in the 1930s up to a little town on the border called Hungerford, rough road. And he told me, he said, I'd pick up kids at Hungerford that night and I'd tie them in the front of the truck with a bit of rope because I didn't have a door. And we drive through the night with those kids sitting in the truck, and we get to Bourke about 4 a.m. And there on the station, waiting for those kids, was Mr. and Mrs. Drummond. He said, geez, they were wonderful people, mate. They were like Jesus out here. Now, those two people, he was a Methodist minister and his wife from Cobar. They used to drive through the back country, and they'd find all these kids there who'd had no medical help, no dental care, never had a holiday, were deprived in lots and lots of ways. So they would pick these kids up, drive them all the way into Bourke, or get the mail truck guy to drop them to the station. Then they'd take them on the train to Sydney. He'd walk into the Macquarie Street specialists and say, I've got no money. These kids have got no money. What are you going to do about it? And so he got all these doctors, specialists to come and help him do things for these kids. Started a home for them to have a holiday out at Manly. It's still there, Far West Children's Scheme. And they've looked after hundreds of thousands of kids since. But it was an expression of his faith in Jesus that sent him out there, love for those kids, love for those people. And people saw, like that mail truck driver, he saw Jesus standing on the platform. You know? And that's, I suppose, those sort of stories ignite in me, Eric, the sense that the footprints of Jesus are all over this country. We're just not seeing them. And we need interpreters who are going to say, listen, you love the Far West Children's Scheme. You love the Flying Doctor Service. My wife and I work here in Dubbo at the exhibition for the Flying Doctor Service. It's a beautiful exhibition. It explains the whole thing. But it doesn't tell you really why he did it. You know, that it was, as a 16-year-old boy, he had a call on his heart from God to do something for Australia. And now we've got 77 aircraft, $10 million a piece or more, covering the whole of Australia. You can be in hospital no matter where you have an accident or you're sick in 2 hours. Well, that is amazing. I mean, where in the world does that happen else? You know, and you get it for free. Like, it's just astonishing. Well, why aren't we allowed to say, you know, Jesus Christ was the one behind this idea, that John Flynn would not have done that. No Jesus, no Flying Doctor Service. And it makes me cranky that we're being edited. No, whatever you do, don't talk about Jesus. Well, why not? He's the most successful leader in human history. Why wouldn't you want to talk about him? And look at what he's gifted us. So it just makes me frustrated and angry that we've been told, you know, you can talk about anything else. And the other thing, Eric, if I can rave on a little bit here, but
go for it.
One of the stories I came across was there were Afghans in Bourke who ran camels in the early part of the 1900s. And they did a sterling service, reaching right into the dry parts of the Outback where only camels could go. And they were great at it. And they helped a lot of those big properties and stations and industries thrive. So there was about 50 or 60 of them in Bourke, and I interviewed a lady who was sold as a bride to an Afghan for £10 during the First World War or before. And she was only 13, and she didn't really understand what had happened, and she lived inside that Muslim community, fairly strict. They kept her inside it. And when I interviewed her at 86 years old, she said, that shed down the yard there, that's where they used to say their prayers. And I said, really? So it was like the mosque in Bourke. The Afghans had gone home long before. A few had stayed, but most went home. So when I was on council, I said, we should rescue that mosque and put it in the cemetery, which they did, and they put it down near a few Afghan graves in the Bourke Cemetery. A few years later, I'm researching on museums, and I'd found that there is a Muslim museum in Melbourne funded by the state and federal government where tens of thousands of people are going and learning about the Muslim contribution to Australia. And I was astonished. I thought, well, wow. And so I looked up their website, and lo and behold, there's a little YouTube clip of these 4 Muslim boys driving around in a 4-wheel drive looking for Muslim history all over Australia. And their big find was in Bourke. And here they were down in front of this little tin mosque in the Bourke Cemetery praying and saying, wow, this is great. Well, at first I was shocked. I thought, wow, you know, I rescued that thing, and did I do the right thing? And then I stopped and said, hang on a minute, Paul, you're a historian. It was there. You can't edit that out.
Right, exactly.
But what did sober me, Eric, was the fact that I thought to myself, now, good for the Muslims. They're out there looking for their story, and they're putting it in a museum and they're telling it to Australia. where are the Christians? Where are the Christian young people driving around our country looking for the Christian story? Why aren't we Christians as proud of our story? Why don't we want to know it and tell our story? And that's what drives me. I think I get passionate when I see that, and I think, come on, get our act together. We've got a fantastic story to tell. Okay, there are bad and ugly things that happened as well, and we shouldn't shirk that. But it's time we stood up and said, excuse me, you're trying to edit this story out. That's not good history. It's dishonest and it's unfair. Right. And all we're asking is, the Christians have given an enormous amount to this country. People like John Flynn and Stanley Drummond and his wife and so on. We have produced an enormous amount of social capital in this country, which Australia is spending. All we're asking is for the chance to tell the story and for you to hear it and make your own mind up about it.
Our guest today is once again the Outback historian Paul Rowe, who's sharing his life journey with us. Next, we'll hear more of Paul's story and about his passion for sharing the impact Jesus has had on Australia. All that more is coming up when we return right here on Real Faith.
The Word for Today is Australia's most widely read daily devotional, designed to give you practical teaching to keep you focused on your relationship with Jesus. Read it online or subscribe to the free printed edition at thewordfortoday.com.au.
You're listening to Real Faith, conversations with real people about how God works in their lives. If you want to know more about integrating faith into your life, our website is realfaith.org.au. Just go to the website and you'll find helpful articles about the impact faith can have on your life. Once again, that's realfaith.org.au.
Welcome back. I'm Eric Scadabo, and today I'm chatting once again with the Outback historian Paul Rowe. Paul's the author of the book, Tell Me Another, A Storyteller's Search for Australia's Lost Faith. Now here's more of the storyteller telling his story. Okay, well, what is the answer then? How are we going to reclaim Australia's Christian heritage? What do you propose? What should we do?
In 2006, there was a big conference in Parliament House in Canberra, and for 2 days we heard brilliant papers presenting Australia's Christian heritage by top-line people in every field. And I left that conference thinking, wow, this is fantastic. But as is often the case with talk fests, the question is, okay, well, we can sit here and convince each other about this, but how do we get it out there in the marketplace? Pretty much what I learned in Burke. Yeah. You can have 14 volumes of Burke history, but unless you put it into a format where people can access it, what's the point? So in Burke, I ended up working on a project called the Backerberg Exhibition Centre, which is there and open today. And it has 20, 30, 40,000 people a year going through reading the stories of Burke. And embedded in them is the stories of what Christians have given to the town. So I learned a lesson from that, Eric, that you can take something that's invisible and make it visible. And people love it. So out of that conference in Canberra, I got alongside a man called Stuart Piggin, who's probably Australia's number one evangelical Christian historian. And he'd been writing a lot of stuff. And I was very rude to him, really, because I said, Stuart, you're writing brilliant stuff, but who's going to read it? Like, if it's just the Christians reading it, and there's probably lesser of them even reading it, we need to get it out there in the marketplace where Australians understand this important part of our history. It's not just an add-on, it's fundamental to our history. So since then, Stuart's written 2 major volumes and a bunch of other academics have done the same. So we've probably never been so well-resourced as we are right now. In the interim, I worked with Stuart and a bunch of other people on an idea to do the same for Australia as we did for Burke. That is, gather the stories and articulate them in an accessible fashion in a high-tech exhibition space that would engage and win people to the story, to say to Australians, you can go to the War Memorial and hear the story of the war, but what about this story? This is a longer, deeper, higher, wider, more embracing story than even the Anzac story, as powerful as that is. This embraces all sorts of Australians. It's not just about men. It's not just about war. And most of those war stories happened outside Australia. what about all these stories that are sitting here right under our feet, right in front of our faces, that need to be told, that people just don't know. Nobody's bothered to tell them. And it's not until somebody stands up and says, hey, come and listen to this story. And I'm talking about not just the airbrushing the Christian history, it's about telling the ugly stories as well. So behind me, you can see on the screen behind me, behind me, I've got some boards telling the story of Bill Ferguson, who here in Dubbo in 1938, he led the first day of mourning in Sydney. He was the Martin Luther King of Australia, and he was lost. People just didn't know his story. A couple of years ago, I worked with an Aboriginal friend to get the story up. His statue is now in the main street of Dubbo, and people see his story every day. And along with William Cooper down in Victoria, another Christian, I tell people this, look, there are 6 Aboriginal people leaders that I know who are memorialised in our country. They're all Christians. But nobody knows that. You don't hear that being talked about. Bill Ferguson, Bill Cooper, who's also memorialised in Israel because he took a stand for the Jewish people in 1938. David Unipon is on the $50 note. Doug Nichols and his wife are in front of the Parliament House in Melbourne. If you go to the Outback Historian website, you'll read a lot of these stories there. And more recently, right beside the Sea of Galilee, there's a statue for the Aboriginal light horseman, and Jack Pollard is the man there. He's kneeling beside his horse over the grave of a friend. In his left hand, he's got his New Testament. So I say to people, listen, I'm not pushing this on you. I'm just telling you, all these leaders were Christians. You join the dots.
Yeah.
And I think that's what I want to see happen, not just in that story, but there are tens of thousands of stories like this across our country. Jesus' footprints are everywhere. And my ambition is, my dream would be to gather all those stories into one place for the very first time, instead of sitting in fusty old, back corner of the church or something, bring them out into the open.
Yeah.
A couple of years ago, I went to a little church, or a church in Cobbitty in New South Wales, and the lady there was telling me this church was built by Thomas Hassel, and he was one of the first. He ran the first Sunday school in Australia, and this is his church. And then she goes to the corner cupboard in the church, and she pulls out this box, big wooden box, pulls it out, and said, "Now this is the medical kit that his parents took with them to Tahiti in 1792 when they went there as missionaries, and he went there as a little baby." And I'm thinking, what? It's sitting in the corner of the church in the back cupboard. Come on. What a story. This young couple had come all the way around the world to a wild part of the world, and they began Sunday schools here in Australia. He travelled all across the backcountry around Sydney as a preacher, a much-loved preacher, and it began industries and all sorts of stuff. Come on. We've got to tell these stories. So I wanted to see, and there's a bunch of us still dreaming that we can do this. We were gifted a brilliant plan by an American architect living in England who said, "I cannot believe your national capital does not have an expression of its faith, of its Christian faith." There's a space there that was meant to have a cathedral. It's never been built. So he gifted us a $500,000 design for nothing of a brilliant building that's Opera House standard, that would attract people there just because it's a building. But it would contain, his passion was that you get the story first, then you build the building. And that, I like that. I think we've got a great story to tell. We're sitting on a great resource here in Australia of fantastic stories that would inspire young people, instead of just going to the War Memorial or Questacon, to come to this and hear these stories of faith that would inspire them and give them hope, and give an honest appraisal of our history, not forcing religion on them, but telling them the real story of real people who did real things in our own country.
Well, that sounds fantastic. Moving right along, unfortunately, we're quickly running out of time.
You talk too much, Eric.
I know. I just need to shut up and listen once.
I apologize.
No worries. I'm loving all this. It's very fascinating. And next, we're going to talk about pilgrimage. What does that mean in your life story?
Oh, my goodness. Well, let me bring it up to date. Last night I was on the phone to a retired engineer from Sydney who wants to bring a group of 9 young people out of Sydney to Bourke through Dubbo, and he asked me to help him do this. And he read the chapter in my book about On the Road to Find Out. And my argument there is saying, look, even though there's a drift out of the churches, and our latest census says, people are leaving the church, doesn't necessarily mean they're walking away from God or disinterested in the God question. They're just perhaps disillusioned with the format. And there are 350 million people on pilgrimage on any given day of the year around the world. They're on the way to find out things. They're seeking meaning. And I talked to a girl just a few weeks ago who'd done the whole pilgrimage thing. She'd done the Camino Trail in France and Spain, walked that 1,000 kilometres, got to the beach, sat on the beach and said, I haven't found the answer. She eventually met some Christians who explained to her the bit that was missing. I think she's typical of a whole generation of young men and women who are seeking meaning, and they're going on the road to find out. It's an old tradition. And I think the churches need to tap into it and say, okay, look, we can join the dots. And that's what I'm going to do for this group. I'm going to show them the Bill Ferguson story. I'm going to introduce them to the Flying Doctor service. I'm going to show them stories in Burke. So those young men and women, I hope and believe they'll catch the fire and say, wow, we've got stories to tell. And then say to them, listen, I've told you a few, but there's 10,000 stories out there that need to be found and researched. You can lead these stories as well. My ambition, Eric, is to see a new generation of young men and women who become storytellers to Australia, who will love our stories, number one, absolutely love them, and then use all their gifts. Could be in radio, it could be music, could be art, whatever, to say we're going to tell these stories and we're going to tell them really well, so that people will see the face of Jesus. You know, my belief is, if it's like those old dot paintings you used to look at and they'd sort of suddenly a face would leap out of the dots, that if we tell enough of these stories, the face of Jesus will emerge out of our history.
Well, thank you so much, Paul Rowe, for sharing your story with us today.
It's a pleasure, Eric, and thank you for giving me a chance. And if people want to look at the Outback Historian website, there's a stack of stories I've been putting up there precisely for this reason, so that they can take them and use them in their space, in their place.
Okay, once again, if you'd like to find out more information about what Paul has been sharing and hear about his story and also the other stories of faith in Australia, his website is theoutbackhistorian.com.au. That's theoutbackhistorian.com.au. And Paul's book is Tell Me Another, A Storyteller's Search for Australia's Lost Faith. Wow, what a beautiful illustration to end today's conversation with the Outback historian, Paul Rowe. And as he said, if we tell enough of the stories of Australia's spiritual heritage, eventually the face of Jesus will emerge out of the history. That's a great way of looking at it, and a great way of emphasizing the importance of Australia's shared spiritual heritage. Well, thank you so much for joining us for this 3-part series with Paul Rowe telling his story and several other stories. Until next time, I'm Eric Scadabo. So long, and God bless.
You've been listening to Real Faith, and if you have any questions or comments, you can send us a message through our website, realfaith.org.au. That's realfaith.org.au. Thanks for listening, and we invite you to join us again next time for more conversations about God working in the lives of people who put their faith and trust in Him. That's real people, real life, and real faith.
Real Faith is a production of Vision Christian Media.
This program is a production of Vision Christian Media. To find out more about us, see vision.org.au.